I mean, the first thing I would say is that I've reached a position where it seems to me that far, far more important than symmetry is asymmetry. But that asymmetry has symmetry implied in it. You don't call things asymmetrical unless they have a sort of implied symmetry. If they're just a random assortment, they're neither asymmetrical nor symmetrical. They're just chaos. But asymmetry implies and negates symmetry. And that implication and negation simultaneously is very important. In biology, I mean, starting with the brain, obviously the brain is superficially symmetrical, but what really matters and is fascinating to me is its asymmetries. And then there are throughout nature symmetry breaking moments, and symmetry breaking seems to be a very important element in biology. And when one thinks of the XX versus XY chromosome arrangements in men and women, there's a sort of symmetry in the XX, there's an asymmetry in the XY, and there's a sort of fruitful asymmetry between the XX and the XY. And so that's just another way in which things are nested like this in nature, in ways that imply a symmetry but then break from it. So I always say what matters is not just symmetry particularly, nor just asymmetry, but the asymmetry of symmetry and asymmetry. Well, that's so often this famous edge of chaos. Yes, that's right. But this business about the asymmetry of symmetry and asymmetry mirrors a number of things of broader philosophical interest to me, which are things like the need for not just, people talk a lot about non-duality in the philosophical realm in which I move, and its importance. But I always say that but there's also duality, and we don't want just non-duality or just duality, but the non-duality of non-duality with duality. And probably the very most essential different way of putting this is that the left hemisphere is very much a matter of either or. One of its jobs is to be decisive. It's to say it's this or it's that. It is very impatient with the idea that it might be several things or more than one thing at the same time. And it cuts almost instantly to a take. But the right hemisphere, which Ramachandran, great neuroscientist, calls the devil's advocate, is always saying, yes, but it could be something else. And so the normal fruitful take of the right hemisphere is not either or, but both and. It could be this and something else. And what's more, it alone understands that that opposites may cohere, whereas the left hemisphere, it just doesn't compute. I mean, opposites just, that's the point, they don't cohere. So what I say following from that is that we don't need either or both and, but we need both either or and both and in order to be able to lead a life. So once again, these symmetries are these nests of sort of alternating symmetries and asymmetries at a philosophical level are also imaged, I believe, in the biology of life. From my rather superficial, well, very superficial understanding of physics, I think there are things that resonate with this in physics. One very important one being, you know, that some physicists believe that at the bottom there is discreteness and granularity. And there are others who says, no, I can see no evidence that at bottom there is discontinuity. This is, things are essentially continuous. And that's a very important theme for me throughout the whole third part, or even actually through the whole of this wretched book that I published last November called The Matter with Things, in which I'm really trying to get to questions about who we are and what the world is and how we can relate, especially if the two hemispheres give us different versions of reality. Which should we prioritize? You know, and so that has to be dealt with first. And then I look at, coming on in the very last part of the book, part 3, which is about 600 pages, looking at the one and the many, the coincidence of opposites, the nature of time, space, matter, consciousness, and their relations, and then values and purpose and the sense of the sacred. So it's an enormous scope. But the things you're talking about, I mean, I probably said enough and far too much, but the things that you're alluding to and the things that we're touching on here are absolutely central to the whole vision of how the world is, however you look at it, through neurology, through physics, through spirituality. In a way, something is only irregular if there is an implied regularity. I mean, an irregularity can only exist where there is a degree of regularity. Otherwise, as I say, it's just chaos. So again, irregularity would seem to me to be the more important of the two, because it kind of already takes the other one in under its wing. Regularity cannot incorporate irregularity, but irregularity can incorporate regularity. Symmetry can't incorporate asymmetry, but asymmetry can incorporate symmetry without annihilating it. Well, I talk about that in this book, but exactly that. And that, I mean, in mathematical terms, symmetry is an operation that leaves whatever it is unchanged. It is that, nothing can change. So everything depends on symmetry breaking. But that in turn depends on there being some ghost of a symmetry behind the asymmetry. Well, you're quite right, and that's haunted me for 30 years. Am I describing what the brain makes of reality, or the nature of reality has led us to develop our asymmetrical brains, which reflects which? And I think it is an impossible question for philosophy to answer, because we can't step outside our own knowledge. So, but my feeling is that it might be neither. And the first person to say that to me was Rowan Williams. He said, why does it have to be either? Why might it not be that, as it were, which is very much in the spirit of my view, that things aren't linear chains, but that everything is responsive, and in reacting to something changes that other thing and changes itself. So nothing changes without something else also changing. And that therefore all processes are an encounter. They're not a kind of A, which is active, does this, to B, which is passive. A and B encounter one another, resonate, reverberate, each is changed. And so that in this process, the brain and the consciousness that it helps mediate for us in whatever way it does, has this structure. And as far as we can see, the world has that structure, and the two correspond. That's the best I can say. Yes, it's more on the side of identity. But as Hegel said, we need the unity of identity and non-identity. So I'm afraid all of these things I'm saying, here's another one from Hegel. But that identity leaves everything static. It's economic. But it's economic because it has very little. It has no potential for growth. It has no creative potential whatever. So it's just repeating whatever there is. And of course, mechanical reproduction, which started to happen in the 19th century, produced this way in which virtually the same thing can be repeated ad nauseam. And there's something very uncanny about it and lifeless. And so, when Blake wrote those amazing lines, tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forest of the night, what immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? I mean, fearful symmetry. There's something about symmetry which is already uncanny, in the way that a zombie is uncanny, because it looks like something living, but actually it's not. And too great an emphasis on symmetry denatures whatever it is. And in fact, human faces are very importantly never symmetrical. And when they're represented as symmetrical, they look to us threatening and uncanny. And so it's often said that we prefer or animals generally prefer, and that may be another thing altogether, but that humans also prefer symmetrical faces. But what they prefer is nearly symmetrical faces. I mean, I think broadly you're right. An observation that I think is often applicable is that children up to the age of about 11 or 12 will often write rather wonderful poetry. But once they get into their teens, the poetry deteriorates because in a way it becomes more self-conscious and they think, I'm writing poetry now. And one way of looking at it is that children are pragmatists. So they're encountering reality in a very empirical way and responding to it without too much overthinking. But gradually, the more theoretically minded part of the brain, which is the left hemisphere, starts to dominate and therefore restricts one's more spontaneous, open receptivity to the nature of reality, which the right hemisphere is good at, by interfering with its own theoretical mapping or diagramming of the world, which is what the left hemisphere does. I mean, one of my sound bites is, the relationship between the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere is like that between a map and the world that is mapped. And one is enormously rich and complex, and the other is extremely simplified, but its value lies in being very simplified. So in the teens, this theoretical mind takes over. And of course, suddenly everything seems terribly simple. Why can't one's parents see that actually it's just like this? So they often go off into very extreme political positions that are based entirely on theory. And it's only after they've had a decade or two of experience of the world and they realize actually it's far more complicated. It doesn't fit into these neat categories. That they start then to recover the proper balance of pragmatism with a theoretical underpinning somewhere, but for quite a long period, the theory dominates. The drive to articulate in language can both sharpen what it is one's saying and very much narrow what it is one can say. This is the story of, the development of language in humans, which I deal with in Chapter 3, Language, Truth and Music, in The Master and His Emissary. So it definitely accelerates this process of conceptual, theoretical thinking. And because the more you indulge in it, the more you only think things that can be put into language, you become less and less aware of all that you experience that simply cannot be put into language at all. And it turns out that it's most of everything. I mean, quite obviously, it's very difficult to articulate really complex things to do with love or human relationships or God or all of these things, but also as the philosopher Brian McGee made in a beautifully simple image, the towel just dropped in a crumpled heap on the bathroom floor is impossible to express in language. No language to express its shape, its shades of color, anything about it. All you can do is take a photograph. And so language fails us all the way through life, except for the immediate business of manipulating a situation. I want to tell someone how to do something. I want to explain these are the ropes. If you do it in this way, a certain thing will happen. So it's part of the role of the left hemisphere, which is simply manipulation, not comprehension. You're quite right that poetry is the way in which language can subvert language. That's effectively what poetry is. It's a good way of thinking of it. It's using language to subvert language. It disconcerts the reader in certain ways, makes connections the reader is not used to, in order to liberate hidden levels of meaning in words. Once they're stuck together in the way that a user manual for some technological device are stuck together, there is no hidden anything. But in the business of living, as we use language, it develops layers of meaning, and those can only be accessed through things like poetry, myth, metaphor, humor particularly is so important, and narrative. all of which are much, much better understood by the right brain. The left brain doesn't understand metaphor, jokes, narratives, myths. It thinks they're all lies. But the right hemisphere sees that these are incredibly important. So, yes, I think that getting that back into the syllabus, I wasn't really aware of how badly things were suffering, but that is terribly important. And I think, the way in which we now only valorize learning information, acquiring information in a way which will get you a reasonably well-paid job in some technical sector. That is not an education. And when you stop educating your people, you start to destroy your civilization. And I believe we're taking a sledgehammer to our civilization right now. It's under attack from all kinds of sources. And they don't seem to have places to step outside. I mean, of course, to see what's happening, you have to be able to step to one side of it and have a standpoint from which to see it. And that standpoint used to be given by, whether one likes it or not, the complexities of a tradition in which certain things were handed down, certain stories, certain myths, certain rituals, some of them religious, some of them not, poetry, music, drama. These things are hugely important for offering richness of perspectives on life. And then, that's where intellectual life actually starts, not with just manipulating figures. Again, in this book, The Matter with Things, I include a photograph of Jefferson's library at the University of Michigan, which is a very Enlightenment building with very clean, entirely symmetrical lines. And it was based on Palladio's villa called La Rotonda, which is in Padua, or outside Padua. And I juxtaposed the photographs of the two. And in the Renaissance one, of course, there is this broad, wonderful symmetry, but there are also beautifully asymmetrical living elements. There are animals and human figures that are not completely symmetrical. And that just seems to me that when it came to the 18th century, we started to we became over in love with symmetry. So you get poetry which is largely rhyming couplets that close down every time you make a point and then you close the point. You strike another point and there's a symmetry there that actually impedes the flow that used to be there in verse and becomes there in verse later. It's interesting. Well, most of the natural sequences in mathematics are also not in favor of closing down to a simple symmetry. I know that there are people who don't believe that the golden section is important in aesthetics, but I think it very clearly is, actually. And while it has a kind of internal symmetry and asymmetry, it's the asymmetry and the symmetry that makes it work. And the Fibonacci series that lies behind phi, the golden section, is also somehow, it's about a spiral, but it's a spiral that's constantly changing and is not resolvable. And all these things that are there in nature that have this fundamental kick in them that is the bit of asymmetry or the bit of handedness or whatever it is that makes the whole thing possible. I think that's so you find it in the Natural History Museum, and you certainly find it in the V&A or whatever. The difficulty would be trying to find symmetrical works of art. I suppose there are. I mean, we make objects, don't we, of daily utility. I can imagine somebody having made in the 18th century an extremely beautiful silver box that was entirely symmetrical. That wouldn't bother us. And one of the things one notices in the enormous beauty, of course, of Japanese art is these often very dramatic asymmetries. So yes, okay, it was a departure. So in that sense, it's original, but it's not really creative because it's not actually allowing anything to come forth from it. Returning us to stereotypical forms. I mean, Plato would have liked it, but but you see, I see Plato in the history of philosophy as having begun much of the trouble that afflicted Western philosophy for 1800 years. The perfection of the entirely abstract form that is somewhere in heaven but is not accessible to the senses. This begins us on a path which had its fruitfulness, but it also has deep dangers in it. And I'm enormously interested in the pre-Socratic philosophers and those who, following after the time of Kant, started to rediscover things that had been obscured by nearly 2,000 years of a sort of belief that the abstract was somehow greater than any flawed, imperfect instantiation. But the flawed, imperfect instantiations is the beautiful whatever it is from which the abstraction is drawn secondarily by the left hemisphere. Imperfectly, there is a place for perfection. So perfection has a home in imperfection, just as imperfection doesn't have a home in perfection. It's another example of how imperfection is the greater one that can include perfection. It can have that moment of perfection and enjoy it, but it will be, in a way, an imperfection in imperfection that creates a moment of perfection, rather than seeing perfection as the basic state of things from which every imperfection from that point of view has departed. In a world in which we are delighted by the imperfect, and let me take the example of Japanese art, which I think is one of the most staggering creations of the human mind. This wonderfully beautiful art, which is almost always in some important way asymmetrical, and the asymmetry brings the whole breathtaking life to it. It could also incorporate, and Japanese art may well have examples of objects that are purely symmetrical, and we can enjoy them. But how lovely that in an aesthetic of asymmetry, there is also a place from time to time for symmetry. But in an aesthetic of symmetry, there is no place at any time for asymmetry. So, asymmetry is greater than symmetry because it can include it, and imperfection is greater than perfection because it can include it. And, when I wrote a book in my 20s called Against Criticism, it was going to be called Against Perfection, but anyway, it wasn't in the end. But I was already thinking the problem here is our love of always a dead perfection. I'm not a foe of precision. I mean, if you're actually going to make an engine that works, you need to be precise to nanometers. So precision is very important. As a doctor, if you get the decimal point in the wrong place, you'll kill the patient. So, it's incredibly important in certain contexts that we have that. And I do believe that one should hold oneself to very high standards, but perhaps one earns being able to embrace imperfection only by going through perfection. One has to have that very precise training in order to be able to relax afterwards and not just have something that's sloppy or chaotic or ugly. So I think that, there's a sort of wisdom that is an unknowing, that is not the same as ignorance, it's the other side of knowing. And there's a kind of thing that one arrives at, the other side of perfection, but you have to have gone through that perfection, perhaps. Part of your education. So, one of the things, because we often talk about education nowadays, and one of the assumptions is almost always made, is that somehow children would be much more creative if they weren't taught to do things to what I would call high standards. I completely reject that. Crikey, when you look at the paintings of Dürer, and you just see the extraordinary technical pains that this man must have somehow lived in to be able to do this wonderful painting. And you think of Leonardo, who at the age of 9 was able to draw so technically perfectly that he would outdo your average draftsman nowadays at the age of 9, but then went on to be one of the great creative artists. So one of the things I dislike is there being a kind of opposition or contradiction between working to very high standards and yet being able to relax and be creative and incorporate. It's slightly like how science works, which is often there has to be a lot of rather hard work done at an early stage, but then the insight, when it comes, is never made by just following more of the hard work. It happens one evening when somebody's late going home, happens to just look up at the stars and then suddenly sees, Oh, spiral nebulae, having worked on it for years. And there's so many moments in the history of physics and science generally. Well, in the natural world, I don't think there is anything that is purely symmetrical. So we then resort to a cerebral construct, to an abstraction such as, a perfect sphere or a perfect cube, the Platonic solids. I'm sure people have copied these things in the world, but I wouldn't want to elevate them. And then all great creative things are asymmetrical, it seems to me. If I wanted an illustration, they're in volume 2 of The Matter with Things. There's a couple of color plates towards the end of volume 2 of Jefferson's library at the University of Virginia and what it was based on, which was Palladio's La Rotonda. And I think one is a perfect example of a sort of beauty but sterile precision and symmetry, and the other is of something that has that wonderful symmetry, but it's somehow more generous. It somehow comes to life in a way. It's not something I've talked about very much in videos. In fact, this is probably the most I've ever talked about it in a video. But I do talk about it quite a lot in the book, in different places. But there is, I tell you what, it has an index with all its imperfections. If one looked up asymmetry, you'd find subheadings, and you could quickly look to various places. There isn't an index to the Kindle version, because unfortunately in a Kindle version there aren't the pages anymore, because page numbers don't apply, which makes it all harder. But in the hard copy, there are. It's a sort of pun on several levels. I mean, the first thing is that something seems to be going wrong with our way of thinking. So what is the matter with things? But then I think the answer is that our obsession with matter and there being only matter, that consciousness is really reduced to matter and everything with it. And our obsession with things, a universe of things, whereas I think it's a universe of processes and fields. And that the fields collapse into things and make things that we can stand forth from the attentional background, and we call them things because we can lock onto them. So it's not made of things that then have to be put together. The things are somehow differentiated out of a background, which is a network, much as in the coming together, a development of an organism. There is no moment at which a heart is made and a kidney is made and liver is made, but the whole organism, as it grows, begins to differentiate asymmetrically into these various things.